live in the Bay Area, and here housing is super expensive. If you have someone living with you and you're worried, what happens if I die? Will that person still be able to live in this house, or are they going to be out on the street? They won't be able to find housing at all. In that case, you might want to set up a life estate or right of occupancy. And in this video, I'm going to talk about all the things you should think about as you set this up and really how it works. If you know somebody who would benefit from this information, I encourage you to hit the share button so this video can be shared with that person and they can also learn this information. So there's certain circumstances that can come up when you might be considering a right of occupancy. You might own a house and you're newly married and your new spouse is living with you, but upon your death, you don't want your spouse to inherit the house, but you want them to be able to live there for a while. That could be one scenario. Or maybe you have some other family members who are living with you and you want them to have the ability to live there for a year upon your death so that they're not just booted out of the house, so they have some time to transition. Or perhaps you have one child who you want to be able to live in your house upon your death, maybe a disabled child, to live there for the rest of their lives. But upon their deaths, you want the house then to be sold and everything to go to the other children. So basically you're delaying the other children's inheritance, but they would understand because they want their disabled sibling to be taken care of. So these are all situations where a life estate or a right of occupancy can be helpful. So what's the difference between those, you might wonder? All right, well, a life estate is basically a right of occupancy for your lifetime. Somebody has the right to live in the property as long as they're alive. And then when they die, or you can also say, if they move out, then that's when that right to occupy the property ends. A right of occupancy is basically the right to live there for a certain amount of time. It could be a year, it could be 5 years, it could be 3 months. But it's basically someone can live in your house for that certain amount of time. Now, when you set up a right of occupancy, there's certain things you should think about. And a lot of times people just say, the house just goes into a trust. Well, there's more to think about with this because houses can be expensive. If you own a house, you understand this. There's the upkeep, there's the gardener, there's the cable bill, all right? There's bigger expenses, there's bigger landscaping, there's replacing a roof, right? All these things can come up. Or what if there's a huge disaster and your house is flooded? So all these things can happen. What happens if somebody's living in the house and something like this happens? So I encourage you to work with your estate planning attorney to detail all these different things. So when I create a right of occupancy, typically it's a subtrust within your revocable trust. And what we do is we say, okay, upon my death, this property goes to my kids, subject, however, to a right of occupancy for my spouse or for somebody else, all right? And then in the right of occupancy, we say, okay, who pays the property taxes? Who pays the mortgage? Who pays for the upkeep? And so we spell that out. Now, if you want the person to live there rent-free, to not have to pay anything, then usually you need to leave some extra cash in the right of occupancy, say, $50,000, $100,000 to pay for those continuing property taxes, the continuing upkeep, the things that can happen if you're not expecting the person living there to contribute. Or perhaps they will pay fair market rent. They might do that. Or maybe you say that they're responsible for paying property taxes. And then you say they're also responsible for paying the gardener and paying for the other things. You should also say now, so usually the trustee of your revocable trust will also be the trustee of this right of occupancy, of this subtrust. Okay. And that trustee needs to have the power to go into the house and make sure it's not totally trashed. Make sure that the person who's living there is providing the upkeep and that the house is still doing okay. All right. So I usually put in that they can come in and check in, once a month or once a year. So that's another thing you'll want to specify in your right of occupancy.
Hey everyone. If you liked my mom's video, like and subscribe.
Okay, so the other thing that's really important to say is, how does this right terminate? We don't want it to be forever and a day, right? Especially in California, all trusts have to terminate after a certain amount of time. We call that the rule against perpetuities. So in the trust, you specify, okay, after a year, or if the person is living there and then they move out. If they move out earlier than a year, that's when the right of occupancy terminates. The other thing that's really important is to say, can anybody else live there? Like perhaps somebody's cousins want to move in as well. Is that allowable? Is it possible for the spouse to sublet one of the rooms or to even rent out the property, right? How much discretion does the person with the right of occupancy have over this property? So this thing that you thought might be very simple is actually pretty complicated because we're trying to think through all the different things that might be needed, all the different scenarios that might come up for somebody else's lifetime, or at least for a certain amount of time. Okay. And this is something that I find so funny when people come in and, I've been helping families for 15 years now. And a lot of these situations come up and they go, oh, this is really easy. Let me just tell you what I want. But they don't realize that really there's a lot of things to think through. Hopefully this video is helping you to think through some of those nuances as you think about creating a right of occupancy. Now, the last thing I want to mention is that California property taxes, which the laws are just so difficult to navigate, all right? Those can be very tricky here because some transfers are not subject to reassessment and some transfers are. I actually have a video on Proposition 19 and California property taxes. I encourage you to watch that. So if somebody has a life estate, typically they are the right to live there and to rent out their property. Typically they have enough power over that property for it to be considered to transfer that to that person. So if that's your spouse, that's okay. But if that's somebody else, that might trigger a reassessment, and all of a sudden this property that you might be paying very low property taxes on, maybe you bought it 30 years ago, and then you leave it to your niece with a life estate, and there's no reassessment exclusion for leaving property to a niece. That property is reassessed, and now your niece is responsible for paying much higher property taxes. So please think through the property tax issues when it comes to leaving a house to somebody else for a short amount of time. So I hope you found this video useful. I do ask you to please hit the notification button, which is a little icon that looks like a bell, and that will let you know when we release new videos, and we do that about every week on Mondays. So I look forward to seeing you at the next video.
Hello everyone! If you liked my mom's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you all next time!